Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
We are recording this on Monday, January 20th. It is currently here in the United States, Martin Luther King Day, and we've done previous programs on what we see as elements of the aspects of the legacy of Martin Luther King, as well as a bigger picture perspective of Martin Luther King and his assassination and his activism compared to some of the other assassinations of the 1960s, including the Kennedy brothers and also Malcolm X. We did a bigger program on a previous Martin Luther King Day, I believe 2018, where we talked a lot about King and his legacy and fitting that into the bigger legacy of the time period that he was at the height of his activism in, and some of what we saw as the ramifications of that time period and the targeted political assassinations of the 1960s, among other things. And we've done other shows where we've talked about issues related to King and his life. And it might be something we revisit in the future, but we're not going to particularly focus on that today. Do you, Jeremy, want to say anything about that before we move on?
Well, I do. My main point on that would be that what it looks like is that when people like leaders within the African American community, for example, the sort of two major leaders that are seen are Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, that it looks like that the main thing when they actually become politically threatening to the different array of forces that are threatened by them, and I would refer people back to what you spoke about in terms of our previous antidote programs about that aspect, is that when they begin to work towards a politics, when they began to understand a politics that was inclusive and dare I say integrating of some sort, and definitely beyond specific either political groupings and or racial or ethnic groupings, and that it was the moment when Malcolm X used his Islam to see a universal human brotherhood beyond just his American black commitments, but that were inclusive of that. And so I would just say that I believe that still continues to be the message that I think is most important during these kind of days, this holiday of Martin Luther King Jr., of the question of a radically inclusive politics being our greatest potential as we the people. And I think, as we might talk about briefly, this question of the way that for both the First and the Second Amendments and the defense thereof of the rights defended underneath the First and Second Amendments have been intensely divided and conquered, and I would also say weaponized.
Yes, thank you for that. And so we will link in our show notes to previous programs we've done that has much more gotten into this particular topic. And I'm sure we'll be revisiting topics directly and indirectly related to this in future programs. So look forward to that. And anyway, today this is where we are beginning what is going to be a very certainly a very interesting. I don't know how long this impeachment trial process is going to last, but we're certainly entering a very interesting time where this is going to begin tomorrow. And of course, also today we've got this massive rally going on in Virginia, and I'm just currently looking at news stories, and it appears that this rally, thankfully, has gone on and has ended peacefully. And I was very concerned about another Charlottesville-style situation rising up in Virginia, where you had Alex Jones was there riding in a tank, and you had members of the Proud Boys were spotted in Richmond, the capital of Virginia, and also there was said to be Antifas and claims of violence could take place. There could be like false flag style violence as relates to these Virginia gun laws that have gotten citizens very upset and very, very concerned. So it looks like on that end that this is at least today, it's going to end on a peaceful note, which is certainly a positive development. I was very concerned that, you could see something happen there. And so the less that happens on that note in terms of any types of provocations, either violent or even significant speech style provocations. That the less that happens on that front, the better. And I'm sure you would concur with that.
I would, but I would also point out that I think that these are larger, wider, more long-term divide and conquer operations of some sort that weaponize real desires to defend rights under the Second Amendment and real desires to defend rights under the First Amendment. For example, under the First Amendment, there's been a sort of a bait and a switch in many ways about that. Yes, all forms of speech other than those that are directly criminal in terms of direct criminal incitement and terrorist threats are protected. And yet at the same time, it's very obvious that the key rights that are protected under the First Amendment is not the rights of hate speech, although that is also protected, but that they're supposed to protect core political rights, i.e. speech that is specifically focused on advocating for or directed towards creating positive political change. And we've discussed before how the entirety of the rights that are put forth as protected under the First Amendment are the crucial political rights, including freedom of religion, which is really about freedom of conscience and a spiritual right, really. And then along with the ones that we usually think of as highly political, such as speech, press, and assembly. And then a Second Amendment in terms of today's event in Virginia is obviously a crucial one in terms of a free society being made up of people who have the rights to defend themselves physically against any and all. And at the same time, as we've discussed and pointed to before, and which we'll let go for now to deal with other, I'd say more immediately pressing matters for today's show, that a lot of the political rhetoric surrounding the Second Amendment has been, I believe, constructed to be highly divisive, both in terms of a left-right scenario, but also in terms of the question of like some of these major shootings, some of them more suspicious than others. It almost always seems to be that it's set up in a way where one side of the divide is concerned that it's going to be used to grab guns, and then thus gun sales go up and all of that. And that whole network surrounding people like Steven Feinberg, as we've pointed out before, in terms of where Cerberus capital interests lie, not only in terms of DynCorp, military contractors, but in terms of, weapons manufacturers here at home. But then also then the aspects of the other side of the divide, maybe the more left side of the divide, begins to call for the weapons are the problem. We need to, do gun control, and there's a wide variety of that situation. And so I believe that there's a lot of questions about the way that this is put forth towards a politics that will keep us divided and conquered, even in terms of issues that are not really usually thought of as being highly weaponized, such as things like abortion, where it's intensely divided and conquered. And they all keep us away from uniting towards a really deep politics where we can think through in a principled fashion the reason for these rights, and then also what are the problems that we actually face in these realms, and how do we want to go about solving our political problems from a perspective that is not first and foremost divided and conquered and ideological.
Yeah, I definitely see this as a very certainly it very much fits into the mold of putting people in their ideological boxes. The fear of guns, whether it's fear of people, whether it's fear of like just a mass population of people who are driven to use, through the fear of things such as mass shootings and the ability of violence to be carried out using weapons, and also the fear of losing your rights to have access to weapons, and for private use, to protect your property, to protect yourself personally, protect your property, or even to protect against government as a means of a counterbalance against your government, as well as even for things such as leisure. I think the common fears of like guns as tools of violence in the hands of people, and also the fear of having guns taken away, the fear of too much access to guns, and also the fear of having your rights to weapons being somehow taken away or infringed upon. I feel that both of those fears definitely, while I think there's certainly a lot of validity on both sides of these debates, I'm more or less finding the truth on something like this in a lot of ways to be, somewhere in the middle. You kind of reach a middle of the road response to some of like the more extreme reactions from both sides of the issue, whether you're coming from it from the quote right side or the quote left side. I'm more or less finding on a lot of these things that the truth on somewhere in here would be to find somewhere in the middle, the radical middle, as you call it, Jeremy. And I think that in this case, it's similar to that. But I definitely see this matter as it fits right into the box of issues that are designed, that are put up with I think a lot of very controlled elements on both sides of this debate. You've obviously got the Bloomberg aspects that are financing all of these gun efforts have got people very fearful. But then also at the same time, you've got this other thing that's not really talked about in the alternative media, so to speak, nearly as much, and that is the profits that come from gun sales in the wakes of events like this. It's almost like these are perfectly, you once again think of the old classic problem, reaction, solution scenario. Problem, we've got too many mass shootings. Reaction, we've got Michael Bloomberg and other left figures who are considered left. I mean, Michael Bloomberg, if you talk to real progressives, they don't consider him a leftist, but, I digress. But, Michael Bloomberg pouring all this money into anti-gun efforts and perhaps at some level lobbying state governments to take certain action on gun laws. Then you've got the other side, the gun lobby, as we call it, pushing the opposite policies. And the reaction is you get people fearful of the government's reaction to this, and you also get people very fearful of the way that what are perceived to be the media and the popular culture is the gun nuts and the way they respond to these issues. So the solution is you've got increased weapons sales as a result of hysteria. Then hysteria over possibly losing your access to having rights to own and bear arms, having infringements on that. And then you also have the solution of you see the other side reacts to these trends, and they react in the very polar opposite manner. It just seems to me that so much of this is just like with so many other things, these types of scenarios just rise up, and they seem to result in scenarios that are just almost, if you're writing a script, like it's just too good to be true. Like this is just, I think, a perfect storm for multiple sides to benefit from, who have a vested interest in continuing to foment further division, further strife in our society, and pitting people in their various ideological boxes that will put them in one extreme or the other in terms of the political aisle and in terms of their stance on the issues of our time, in a way that just continues to further drive a wedge between people. In this Virginia rally, while it appears, thankfully, that there's not going to be any serious incidences coming out of this, but you talked about the longer term aspect of the nature of this, and we're going to see more events like this as time goes on, as these issues continue to get more and more weaponized. So I certainly see it fitting into that. I just try to caution against like falling into like either what we might see as the extremes on either side of this debate. On one hand, yes, be very, very invested in understanding the importance of the Second Amendment, the right that people do have to protect their families and protect their properties and to have, weapons. But also at the same time, just don't buy into a hysteria one way or the other that either it's the imminent threat of like an imminent government takeover, government's imminently going to enter into your house to steal all your firearms, or the other side that if we just have a nation of, we have armed citizens and we're just going to start seeing just people take impending vigilante justice into their own hands on a mass scale. I would just advise against falling into either extreme on a matter like this.
And I would just put in one final plug for the nature of the radical middle, especially in terms of the New York Times doing their recent endorsement of the Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar, as they said, the making sure that they're respecting both the radical and the pragmatic instincts that are showing themselves. And so I would point out this, putting aside whether either one of those candidates represent either one of those qualities of pragmatism or radicalism, I would say that one of the purposes of the radical middle as proposed political philosophy is that it is both. It is both radical, meaning, i.e., the idea of radic, going to the roots. That means also rooting out, meaning rooting out corruption, criminality, but also going to the root of problems, meaning principles, solving political crises from first principles, but then also the pragmatic, meaning how do you apply principle, i.e. what's usually thought of as ideological or radicalism, how do you apply it in a practical fashion without sacrificing one to the other, okay? And I believe that that's the only kind of politics that are actually going to work, is a politics that holds together these crucial principles of pragmatism and radicalism.
Okay, so now that I mentioned it before, I alluded to it, that is the impending circus that's coming up with this impeachment trial, which is beginning tomorrow with opening arguments beginning. And this very well could be a spectacle unlike anything else we've seen in television media in terms of our daily news cycle. I expect this to be quite the event, to say the least. Now, it'd be an understatement, and I hope Alan Dershowitz, I hope he appears on television. I hope he's focal to this. I hope he's out there making the pro-Trump case as much as possible, because I want to, people who are on the pro-Trump side, I think, need to see someone like Alan Dershowitz out there defending him as much as possible. Maybe some type of a sign will go off in some people's heads that maybe this Trump operation isn't all we're making it out to be if someone like Dershowitz is at the front. So I see that as a possible positive if Dershowitz is out there defending Trump as much as possible. But outside of that, on this impending, what is going to be a big time media circus with this impeachment trial coming up, I do want to throw out one more time what has been one of the, if not the central basis of our show the last couple of years. That is that, Russiagate, as we call it, whatever you want to call it, it's not a myth. It's not a made up fabrication. It's not a fantasy. In fact, I want to lay out once again that this is something that, if anything, it's been underreported and it's been limited in its scope. And we've named a variety of sources that we've used to point to what we believe combined will paint a very good picture of the Trump operation and what Donald Trump represents and what the 2016 election represented. And I'll just throw out one more time just a couple of those sources. Seth Abramson's series of books, Proof of Collusion and Proof of Conspiracy. You've got Craig Unger's House of Trump, House of Putin, which gets into the long-term history of of Donald Trump's relationships with the Russian-based organized crime syndicate based out of the former Soviet Union. Then you've also got, there's been some good work within the resistance aspects of the resistance, social media through such people as Jay McKenzie. And there have been other individual researchers who we've pointed to in the past, such as Lincoln's Bible. And I don't want to forget people. There's a lot of great names out there, but we've referenced the work of some people on social media who have been doing a great job in terms of putting together different pieces of the puzzle as it comes to Trump and Russia and the bigger global geopolitical picture going on. And then I would even throw in for a bigger perspective in terms of a long-term perspective, of a global perspective, bringing in things such as the power of Zionism in Israel and as it relates to this, as well as even China and Russia in what we call the multipolar world. I'd throw in people like John Swinn's analysis, The World Needs This Man, and I would mention Brendan O'Connell, among others. So there's I believe, a lot of great sources out there that are kind of getting through the barriers within the alternative media, both quote right and quote left, that just want to simply portray this as being nothing to look at. This is all just a myth and a hoax and a fabrication and just a big old distraction. So I would argue one more time that this is being underreported, if anything, and that in this impeachment trial, now that it's made it to impeachment, to this process, we weren't sure if it was going to initially. It seemed that Nancy Pelosi was initially making some moves that seemed that she might play a similar role that she played in the Bush administration and not push for this. Although now it appears, and we weren't quite sure if that was going to happen, but now it is happening. But I guess what I would advise now is that either, Trump's going to get off on this somehow, either through the Republican Senate, or else, if anything happens, Trump will, maybe it'll be a Richard Nixon type scenario where Trump, you could say, takes a fall, but other figures that are in this whole drama are going to, in the much bigger picture, I think, is going to, unfortunately, as we've seen so many times in our history with these events, is going to, much bigger picture, I think, is just going to stay hidden to the general public. And so I would just advise, to finish off my point here, to just reiterate that I think we're not seeing the full truth of this. And in fact, we're seeing a combination of a hysteria that's actually where the media is actually playing into the discrediting of this narrative within so much of the alternative community, both right and left, while the actual scope of what appears to be going on with Donald Trump and the bigger picture around him is actually very much being limited and downplayed. And on our last show, we were going to discuss, we really didn't have time to get into it, but this recent story that came out from forensicnews.net regarding Donald Trump's Deutsche Bank loans. Jeremy, do you want to talk more about this?
Yeah, because last week I sort of hinted that there might be a wag the dog timing to the Trump order to murder Soleimani and others, and that it wasn't just specifically about the approaching impeachment, but maybe that was part of it. But this reporting goes back to some of the core reporting that we've talked about, that we believe has been playing behind the scenes at these key moments of aspects of the Trump administration, including when around such people as Justice Kavanaugh and the stepping down of Justice Anthony Kennedy, and where at that point we went into the background using sources such as the book Super Mob by Gus Russo, and other books about California-centric, i.e. Kosher Nostra, the Jewish organized crime in the United States of America. And we pointed out things such as Justice Kennedy was, I believe, led the way on the Supreme Court ruling on Citizens United, that's often talked about mainly as the unleashing of just mass amounts of money into politics, which is true, but it also has to do with the idea of being able to factor in more and more of these global organized crime money into American politics. And we pointed out the background of Deutsche Bank there, with Kennedy's son being at Deutsche Bank in these key moments of when Trump basically had no American lenders, and Deutsche Bank had set up shop in the U.S. and became Trump's basic lender of last resort. And so this article that was published on January 3rd, 2020, is titled "Trump Deutsche Bank Loans Underwritten by Russian State-Owned Bank Whistleblower Told FBI" by Scott Stedman, Eric Levi, and Bobby Denault. And some of the figures, even people that you might have mentioned before, who've done good factual work on the Mogilevich network and on the background of Trump Russian organized crime, to people such as Jay McKenzie, have immediately basically written this off because of the sourcing of it and Scott Stedman's involvement and the question of the credibility of this whistleblower. But I think this is very serious reporting and has very serious implications. So I just wanted to make sure that we at least put it on the record this week before we get back into the bigger geopolitical issues of Iran, Israel, U.S., Russia, the plane downing, what we might call the question of clean break cyber doctrine, clean break cyber wars, which we'll move into in the last half of our show here. But I just want to read a little bit from this article to say what it means and where it heads, because it is really, especially in terms of what you talked about, Greg, about how there's an aspect of no Russia, quote unquote gate, Trump Russia. That investigation is not a nothing burger, as what's his name called it. What was his name?
Oh yeah, you mean Van
Van
Jones
Jones.
to James O'Keefe of Project Veritas? Yeah.
Yeah,
And
and so
there's nothing to see about that. I mean, there's nothing sinister or nothing out of place about CNN having like being closely intertwined with the with the Center for the National Interest or anything like that. Nothing to see there.
exactly, the CNN and CNI conjunction is not a nothing burger either, and so that the truth is darker, deeper, and wider than any of your Democrat in Congress are telling you, right? And that's what we've been putting forth. Russiagate is not a nothing burger. There's real Russian state involvement in aspects of cyber war, cyber information operations against the U.S. politics, and it goes beyond just Russia into Russian organized crime, the Kosher Nostra, the Russian-Israeli nexus, the question of Netanyahu and Israel, and of course this question of the Red Sea conspiracy, as Abramson talks about it. But in terms of the actual money flow, this stuff is even more direct and more criminal, openly criminal, than is being talked about, which is really what should become front and center here is why isn't this question of Donald Trump the money launderer for organized crime, apparently asset of for many, many years, why isn't that aspect being dealt with in terms of this impeachment inquiry, right?
Yes,
Okay.
and I would just want to throw in there that everybody's so focused on this phone call and the nature and the details of what Trump did or did not do as it relates to Joe Biden or as it relates to U.S. aid to Ukraine with this phone call. And yes, while that matters, it's also, I think, it is a wedge issue. It is an issue that's used to, on one hand, that is used, I think, to take away attention, I think, from what is the much bigger picture of what's going on here. And if you want an example of a bigger picture, I'd say one of the names is at the very forefront of this whole process is obviously Rudy Giuliani, the man who basically cleaned up New York City and brought down the Gambino Italian crime families that were in control of New York City and basically replaced them with this very same Russian, Soviet-centric organized crime syndicate that's been so close to Donald Trump for all these years, that has very much been involved in the what appears to be the laundering and the washing of money through Trump's properties over the past decades. And you think about that, and I think that right there points to whatever seems to be going on in Ukraine with this not even just so much even the nature of the policy as it relates to Ukraine. And certainly there is a very Russian-centric approach to that as it relates to things such as Donald Trump's Russia policy being shaped by figures within the sphere of the Center for the National Interest and other mainly within this Russian-centric element within the U.S. establishment that's not discussed nearly as much as, say, other operations are discussed. But if you want to, it appears that this Ukraine thing is very much being designed to limit, I think, the scope of bigger things that could come out of this. And I would put, obviously, even someone like Giuliani and his various associates, such as the Len Parnas. And we might take some time in a future show to talk more about some of Len Parnas's recent disclosures and things that have come out of his recent interviews that are very interesting. But I think you can just see the confluence of figures such as this as being a sign that there's something much bigger going on, Ukraine and globally, that's not being discussed in relation to this. And this whole Ukraine thing being at the center of this phone call, being at the center of this impeachment inquiry, is just really moving us away from matters that are much bigger. But if you look at this from a mob perspective, I mean, there's even people right in the forefront of this that you could point at as being indicative of something much bigger going on than just the nature of a phone call and aid to Ukraine and investigations of the Biden family.
Yes, and I agree that I don't think it's necessarily an impediment, but it's not put in context, because it's clearly like the evidence as that's been put forth on the record around this Ukraine phone call, and the more that's come out even in terms of what Parnas has supplied, it's indicative that this was an impeachable. This is obviously the usage of foreign policy for personal political interests. But the problem is that it's not being put in the larger context for the American people to understand that this was not just some isolated, crazy Trump Giuliani scheme. No, goes way back in terms of the networks that helped put Trump in. And so such figures as Dmitry Firtash is coming more and more into focus. And even some of the recent disclosures by Parnas include notes about replacing Lanny Davis, who had been Firtash's lawyer, including the Clintons' lawyer, Lanny Davis, with someone else, and who steps into the mix, but the Joseph DiGenova and his wife Tenzing.
Yes, Victoria Tenzing, the attorney for Scooter Libby, the Iraq War architect who was pardoned by President Trump.
Yes, and that just reminds me that we should put on the table that it's now coming out that David Wurmser is at the epicenter of the Trump-Iran policy that's being deployed, and including the Soleimani assassination. And I would say, what else is going on in the wake of that? So that really shows you what these networks are. And the part of the issue, of course, is that these what so-called Russian oligarchs, the sort of very highly integration of the deep state national security apparatus, especially in Russian intelligence, but also combined with organized crime, that some of these major figures, whether it's the Oleg Deripaska's or even the Semyon Mogilevich's, have been represented by real big-time people in the American national security establishment, anywhere from people like former FBI Director William Webster, to people like Louis Freeh has been involved in these circles, or Bob Dole, in relationship to Oleg Deripaska. So this goes all the way to the top of American society in terms of the potential corruption represented by these networks. And so that's part of the reason, very likely, why we're not hearing all about this, even through those channels that are supposedly telling us the resistance truth, or even those alternative left media channels that should be, very much opposed to Donald Trump, and yet are still calling to this day that there was completely made up about the Russian involvement in relationship to backing Trump. So into this story. Okay. The important line is first, actually. So, Trump Deutsche Bank loans underwritten by Russian state-owned bank, whistleblower told FBI. Quote, Deutsche Bank's loans to Donald Trump were underwritten by Russian state-owned VTB Bank, according to the whistleblower, whose collection of thousands of bank documents and internal communications have captured the recent attention of federal investigators. Val Brockschmidt acquired the emails and files of his late father, Deutsche Bank executive William S. Brockschmidt, after Brockschmidt tragically took his own life in 2014. Val informed the FBI in late 2019 about his knowledge of VTB's underwriting of Trump's loans, information he attributed to a network of sources connected to the bank he cultivated over the past 5+ years. Okay. So this is, I just wanted to put that there. And I understand Val Brockschmidt, who's the source of this, he's a fairly wild character, and I can understand the question that people bring up of credibility in terms of sort of, very open about drug use and, certain aspects of his wild personality. But he's got the receipts. He's got the documents, and it's very clear that he is taken very seriously by the FBI, and it looks like the information that he supplied not only FBI investigators, but even, I believe, investigators in Italy looks like they've very, in the wake of his information, have led to actual arrests of mob-type activivities. So there's something very serious here.
And it's very interesting if you look through this article that Brockschmidt describes this New York Times article that was written on him that he describes as, quote, pardon my French here, completely fucked me over in terms of describing him as just as a fame-seeking opioid user, basically, and that right there just automatically creates a picture in people's minds that this is not someone to be taken seriously. And that's interesting, especially when you look at the longer-term history of the New York Times and information that's come out about efforts by the New York Times to run cover for the Jeffrey Epstein operation for many years through reporters that were entrenched in the Times that had close relationships with Epstein that were put on as their primary reporter on things related to Epstein. And then, of course, even the longer term nature of the New York Times being a major part of the media landscape, certainly within the New York area press, but also nationally, that was involved very much in creating the image of Donald Trump as we know him today and his rise to power and fame. And then you can even look into the writing of people like Jay McKenzie on someone like Maggie Haberman, the New York Times chief reporter on things related to Trump and the political aspects of his presidency. And so you see that, and that to me this would add fuel to the fire that this is someone legitimate who is to be taken seriously, and just the efforts to, I think, a very underhanded, it seems like, if you're to believe Mr. Brexman here, and based on the gravity of the allegations he's bringing out, that this would be the headline of him would just be to try and just simply label him just a wild drug user who just happens to have information about Trump and his dealings with international banks that could actually lend credence to the true effort to actually hold Trump accountable for things. It's something very much wrong with it.
Yes, and so we'll link to that article, and then also we'll do the link to the Wikipedia page of Rosemary Vrablick, who Greg and you and I have spoken about. I don't believe we've ever brought her up on the show before, but she's the key figure in the midst of all this in terms of this specific Deutsche Bank U.S. unit that would continue to back Donald Trump through all of this. And she has a very interesting background that maybe we'll get into a little bit more deeply in the future. But just to quote very quickly, her clients have included prominent wealthy individuals such as Donald Trump, Jared Kushner, Herbert Simon, and Stephen M. Ross. And it does look like that she was crucial to such big real estate transfers as Kushner purchasing New York real estate from, I believe it was the Israeli or African International Group of the Lev Leviev. And so these are some real crucial connections here. And her background in moving into the banking sector says it was a chance 2-hour train conversation with Howard Ross, the then chief credit officer of Bank Leumi, which is one of the key, top 2 or 3 Israeli banks. And so there's an interesting background there.
Yeah, it's interesting the timing of this event as it related to the Soleimani killing of Soleimani. There may be a direct relation, there may not be a direct relation, but it certainly did get people's minds off of. And we got to remember, we've got a very short attention span, I think, as Americans, unfortunately, in this current information age. It seems that people's mind, we do have kind of short memories in terms of just the constant cycling nature of the 24-hour news cycle and all the different stories that go out there and the massive ways of achieving so many different ways of getting information. So you take that into consideration, and something like Soleimani just completely blew this off the map, and now we're getting back into the impeachment narratives taking front and center again, and once again people can get back into their various ideological boxes as we were talking about before, and either be for it or against it. And it seems that once again the middle road, and trying to take a nuanced perspective on why this is necessary, but also why and how certain people that proclaim to be leading the effort to hold Donald Trump accountable are not being straight and narrow about it. So once again, you have that inability, or it seems it's increasingly difficult to try and take like a nuanced middle ground approach on these things. So I guess we'll be revisiting this topic. Any final thoughts, Jeremy? 'Cause I'm going to let you take the floor and discuss some work that you've been looking into, following up on what we discussed last week with regards to the crashing of this Ukrainian plane in Iran, and the theory that you brought out on our show last week. Any final thoughts on that before I give you the floor to get into what you've been looking into?
Just someone tell people like Jimmy Dore to look into this information about Trump Russia. This is journalism that's taking place in his neck of the woods there in Los Angeles. And this is very, very serious. And it shows that Trump Russia was not completely made up. But no, the New York Times, if they're lying about things or covering up things, it's not that they're making up Trump Russia. It's that they're covering up Trump Russia, Jimmy.
Absolutely.
Okay. So let's move into this question of cyber clean break, we might call it, especially in relationship to what we're hearing about David Wurmser being at the core of this. David Wurmser is core to the clean break paper in 1996 that was put forth to Netanyahu, and that even to this day, with The Intercept writing up the article that's actually based on about Wurmser, it's based on, who is it, on Eli Lake? Was it on?
Eli Lake, yes.
In Bloomberg News, getting these memos that were put forth in relation by John Bolton, it looks like, or to John Bolton by Wurmser, that were apparently being rejected by large aspects of the Pentagon at the time, until Donald Trump decided to pull the trigger on this early this year here. That even in the midst of this Intercept write-up, they reference the clean break paper of 1996, but they only tell their audience that it called for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and they still don't tell people that it called for a rollback war. Come on, Tulsi Gabbard, not only regime change wars, but rollback wars, clean break wars.
It's much more than Tulsi Gabbard, unfortunately. It's like the entire alternative media, but I hear you.
Yeah, and so, but it is interesting that this key piece of the clean break doctrine around Syria, how Syria was actually mission accomplished. Someone should sort of say it. I know we're not going to get the George Bush on the aircraft carrier moment about mission accomplished, but really, that's what was laid out in terms of this document. I'd say mission accomplished in terms of Syria. And then all those people that quote unquote forget to remind you of this, whether it's from the left or people like Max Blumenthal, or people like on the right like Ryan Dawson, who are never going to tell you that there's an aspect of this where the U.S. and Russia played the partners of this aspect, this element of the Israeli so-called security state, to enable for mission accomplished in Syria. And that it was not, the point was not to regime change Assad. The point was to do exactly what they did, was to wage serious war on the Syrian people, destabilize it politically, roll back their chemical weapons deterrent, and it's mission accomplished. And meanwhile, Russia's more in the fold.
Not just in Syria and the Middle East, not just in Syria, but also in terms of ultimately creating advancing along this power vacuum that's being created, with the U.S. under Trump actually starting to lessen its influence in the region, and then also even in the Western world in terms of Europe and this stoking of this migration crisis, and how this has really just furthered the flames so much for all of this divisiveness we're seeing in the West, in Europe in particular, and also in the U.S. It's made the rise of this right-wing pseudo nationalist populism that we're seeing in so many European countries, as well as the election of Trump. I think that's another key factor of this that has been very much perpetuated, and the U.S. and Russia kind of both played a role in this. And I would look at someone like Michael Flynn as being key to that, with Flynn playing the primary roles of like the Russian peacenik, also very much in bed with the Israelis and the Zionist angle via Michael Ledeen, also being the person to blow the whistle on al-Qaeda while promoting better relations with Russia and also pushing the hawkish line on Iran at the same time. So.
Yeah. And so in terms of this, what is going on, I just want to put the hypothesis again front and center first, that I believe that it looks like more and more that the downing of the Ukrainian plane by Iranian anti-aircraft missiles, Tor M1 system, shot down by two different missiles about 30 seconds apart. These were Russian-made, Russian-supplied, and these were one of the systems that was described as having been potentially compromised by Israel via its relationship with Russia. But I also last week said that I think that it's very possible that there's aspects of more maybe air-based offensive electronic warfare aspects of this, such as Suitor, such as the program that has been used to insert things in enemy anti-aircraft systems. I believe that there's a combination of that very likely took place, and that this plane downing was part of the larger scale operation that included the assassination of Soleimani. And it's looking like that more and more. And as I hypothesized, that I said that, that Russian backed media would be front and center in the smearing of the technicals, I believe that is what we see. And there's a lot of focus via Russian-based and then also Russian-centric alt media that try to almost look like they take Israel out of the equation and paint it all onto the United States as the suspect. And although I also suspect that aspects of U.S. electronic warfare were very likely involved, like I said at the time, I still believe it. I still think Israel was the mover of this, and maybe was like the lone mover that worked in certain aspects of conjunction with the U.S. electronic warfare systems. So, but again, I also want to say that the specifics of this situation can also then need to be unpacked, not only to do justice for the almost 200 dead humans in relationship to the plane, but also in terms of where this is all going in terms of military strategies in relationship to potential attacks, but also in terms of the longer term threat of cyber warfare, cyber domination, especially in relationship to this Israeli high technology sector. And so I just want to begin putting some sources onto our record here, where there are some key historical and contextual evidentiary elements to consider in relationship to this situation. And so the first one, I just wanted to read the title of a bunch of these, just so that people can look them up if they want to. So the first one that I want to read from, once I get back to it, is from May 1st, 2008, The Hunt for the Kill Switch. Are chip makers building electronic trapdoors in key military hardware? The Pentagon is making its biggest effort yet to find out, by Sally Adee. And Brendan O'Connell has featured this article, and it's a really important dig that he did in terms of finding this. And I believe on his channel, I think he's read this entire article onto the record. And so I would say that people can go find that. And then there's a bunch of books that, very much they're very quote unquote mainstream journalists, and there are some key pieces of a lot of these books. One being The Perfect Weapon by David Sanger, who's a New York Times journalist, has worked with Maggie Haberman, subtitled War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. And I actually found out about some of these passages in some of these books from someone on Twitter who had featured some of these pages, and then I went and got them at the library. And there's those passages and more that are crucial in terms of the context here. Then there's another book titled Dark Territory: The Secret History of Cyber War by Fred Kaplan. Then there's a book called Cyber War: The Next Threat to National Security and What to Do About It by Richard A. Clarke and Robert K. Naik. And then the book Countdown to Zero Day: Stuxnet in the Launch of the World's First Digital Weapon by Kim Zetter. And then two other books, Cyber Spies by Gordon Carrera, The Secret History of Surveillance, Hacking, and Digital Espionage. And then a book that I've mentioned before, The Weapons Wizards: How Israel Became a High-Tech Military Superpower by Yaakov Katz and Amir Bobat. And so, yes, none of these books will actually give you the full, deeper story around things like September 11th and maybe some of the multipolar architecture of Israel as an asset, this pivot point and all of that. But some of the basic historical analyses of cyber war, Israel's role in it, the U.S. role in it, Russia's role in it, the Chinese presentation. A lot of that is there, and also including Iran, which is why I wanted to bring it up for this show. So I'm going to read just the first few paragraphs of The Hunt for the Kill Switch by Sally Edie.
Just a very quick comment, or I'll make this very quick, is that I was pointing this out to you earlier when you were describing some of the operations in this book. In these books that you found, is that this is almost in some ways whether the people who write this book or not know it. This is in putting out this information. This is in a lot of ways, it's very supplementary material to the kinds of Seth Abramson's geopolitical work that he's put together in terms of the global nature of the 2016 campaign and the efforts to get Trump elected. And then it just shows, once again, a lot of symmetry and similar types of operations taking place between these various countries and these various elements within these countries as far as issues related to technology and cyber issues in terms of Israel, Russia, and elements within the U.S. as well as China, as you mentioned.
So the main historical incident that I believe is resonant with what's going on right now is what's called Operation Orchard, involving Israeli bombing in Syria about a little more than 10 years ago. And almost all of these books describe it from the basic facts are fairly agreed upon, and they all have to do with the use by the Israelis of cyber operations, electronic warfare operations, very likely involving things like suitor applications against anti-aircraft systems, that you can begin to glean some of the parameters for what looks like likely happened in relationship to the Iran Tor-1 missile anti-aircraft downing of the Ukrainian plane. And I just wanted to point out before I forget that people should also then go look at the nature of who was on the plane. I mentioned it last week, but this is also begins to hint at Israeli involvement to me too, is that it looks like there were promising Iranian-born or Iranian of Iranian heritage, scientists, engineers in different parts of the world, including there were some British citizens, some Canadian citizens, Ukrainians, obviously, and a strong, especially from the Canadian Albertan area, a lot of people in like really hard sciences. There's very promising computer scientists, electrical engineers, biology scientists, and then that then reminds me of what was alleged by Iraqis and I'll just quote the title of this article from that I found on axisoflogic.com, titled "Mossad Murdered 530 Iraqi Scientists: The Plight of Iraqi Academics" by Special Report on Al Jazeera, Tuesday, May 9th, 2006. And I'll link to this. See if you can find information about this on the internet. It's very difficult to do at this point, but it points out that the Israelis, in working in some aspect with the U.S., where the U.S. would approach these academics and these scientists to work with them first, and if they refuse to work with the U.S., then the Israelis would come in and assassinate them. And it says that prior to April of 2003, that there was no assassination apparent campaign against Iraqi scientists and academics. And so I just wanted to put that onto the record as some MO background to what we see in terms of the target here, not just in terms of the psychological warfare dimensions of the way that the downing of the plane was immediately used directly to create instability and political upheaval inside of Iran, and to take down Iran internationally in terms of credibility after admitting to shooting down a civilian airliner. But also the question of who was actually targeted. Was it an operation that involved mutual perceived benefits of the people who actually were the architects of it? Okay, so the hunt for the kill switch. First page, quote, last September, remember this is written in May 2008. Quote, last September, Israeli jets bombed a suspected nuclear installation in northeastern Syria. Among the many mysteries still surrounding that strike was the failure of a Syrian radar, supposedly state-of-the-art, to warn the Syrian military of the incoming assault. It wasn't long before military and technology bloggers concluded that this was an incident of electronic warfare and not just any kind. Post after post speculated that the commercial off-the-shelf microprocessors in the Syrian radar might have been purposely fabricated with a hidden quote-unquote backdoor inside. By sending a pre-programmed code to those chips, an unknown antagonist had disrupted the chip's function and temporarily blocked the radar. That same basic scenario is cropping up more frequently lately, and not just in the Middle East, where conspiracy theories abound. According to a U.S. defense contractor who spoke on condition of anonymity, a, quote, European chipmaker, unquote, recently built into its microprocessors a kill switch that could be accessed remotely. French defense contractors have used the chips in military equipment, the contractor told IEEE Spectrum. If in the future the equipment fell into hostile hands, quote, the French wanted a way to disable that circuit, unquote, he said. Spectrum could not confirm this account independently, but spirited discussion about it among researchers and another defense contractor last summer at a military research conference reveals a lot about the fever dreams plaguing the U.S. Department of Defense, DoD. Feeding those dreams is the Pentagon's realization that it no longer controls who manufactures the components that go into increasingly complex systems. A single plane like the DoD's next-generation F-35 Joint Strike Fighter can contain an, quote, insane number, unquote, of chips, says one semiconductor expert familiar with that aircraft's design. Estimates from other sources put the total at several hundred to more than 1,000, and tracing a part back to its source is not always straightforward. The dwindling of domestic chip and electronics manufacturing in the United States, combined with the phenomenal growth of suppliers in countries like China, has only deepened the U.S. military's concern. Okay, so then we only have a couple minutes left, but I just wanted to put on the record that I believe that what we really need to understand is like last week, we referenced Stuxnet is crucial, and this Operation Orchard is crucial. And then there's another key operation that was titled Nitro Zeus by the U.S. Cyber Command that looks like it dumped a bunch of malware all over Iranian infrastructure, including into IRGC installations and anti-aircraft missile systems. Okay, so the background evidence of the parameters being there for this downing of the Ukrainian flight by Iran in Iran to have been a cyber war false flag by some element is very, very much there. And I just wanted to point out that in the book Countdown to Zero Day, Stuxnet and the Launch of the World's First Digital Weapon by Kim Zetter, on page 378 and 379, it talks about in November 2013 that Israel held a simulated exercise at Tel Aviv University that was about a situation very similar to this, where at some point, quote, then the network attack spread to the United States, forcing Wall Street trading to a halt and shutting down air traffic control at JFK Airport. The White House declared a state of emergency after 2 planes crash landed and killed 700 people. This time the attacks were traced first to a server in California, but then puzzlingly to Israel, unquote. And so I just want to leave it there in terms of the historical background of the situation. And I guess until next week, Greg, Antidote, we out. Thank you.
All right. Talk to you next time.